Story 1. The Whispering Woods of Black Creek. The mist clung to the gnarled oaks like spectral shrouds, each branch a skeletal finger pointing deeper into the oppressive silence of Black Creek woods. Elias gripped the worn leather straps of his backpack, the chill seeping not just into his bones, but into the marrow of his courage. He dismissed the old local legends as campfire tales, the ramblings of isolated minds. The woods consume, they'd whispered in the dusty general store. They take what they find and leave only echoes. He'd scoffed, of course. A seasoned tracker, Elias had navigated far more treacherous terrains than these supposedly haunted groves. But as the last sliver of twilight bled from the sky, painting the eastern horizon in bruised purples and ominous grays, a prickle of unease began to trace its icy path up his spine. His mission was simple: locate the crashed drone, a prototype for a new environmental monitoring system that had vanished from radar 2 days ago somewhere within Black Creek's heart. The coordinates were vague, the last signal faint. He'd packed enough rations for 3 days, a high-powered flashlight, and his old hunting knife more for cutting through brush than for anything else, he'd told himself. Now, with the temperature dropping sharply and the woods growing unnaturally quiet, the knife felt more like a flimsy prayer. He pushed through a curtain of damp ferns, their fronds brushing against his face like clammy fingers. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something cloying and ancient, like stagnant water and decaying leaves. It was then he heard it, a sound like dry leaves skittering across the forest floor, but too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was a shuffling. He froze, straining his ears, heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing. Only the steady drip of condensation from the canopy and the frantic pulse in his temples. He took a cautious step forward. Shuffle. Scrape. It was closer now, just beyond the thicket of thorns. Elias unholstered his flashlight, its beam a stark, defiant spear against the encroaching darkness. He swept it across the undergrowth, illuminating twisted roots and shadowy hollows. And then he saw it. Not an animal, not a person. It was a doll, or what remained of one. Its porcelain face was cracked and stained, one glass eye missing, the other staring blankly into the void. Its dress, once white, was now a tattered, mud-caked shroud, clinging to a body that seemed too small, too fragile. But what made Elias's blood run cold was its arm, extended, palm up, as if reaching. And then, slowly, impossibly, its head tilted. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper drifted from its cracked lips, carried on the damp air. Lost! Elias stumbled back, tripping over a hidden root. The flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam spinning wildly before settling on a cluster of more dolls. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They hung from branches like macabre fruit, lay half-buried in the leaf litter, leaned against tree trunks, their empty eyes following him. Some were porcelain, some cloth, some crudely fashioned from sticks and rags. Each one was ancient, decaying, yet each seemed to possess a lingering, malevolent presence. And from every single one, a chorus of faint, reedy whispers began to rise, a cacophony of lost voices swirling through the silent woods. Lost, so lost, join us. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging, overriding the primal fear that threatened to paralyze him. He had to get out. He turned, blindly pushing through the dense foliage, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, swirling around him like a suffocating cloud. He could feel unseen hands brushing against his skin, hear faint, childlike giggles mingling with the desperate pleas of the lost. The trees themselves seemed to press in, their branches weaving a cage around him. The ground underfoot became slick with mud. Then something else, a viscous, black ooze that clung to his boots, pulling him down. He slipped, his knee twisting painfully. As he fell, his hand plunged into the muck, and his fingers closed around something cold and metallic. He pulled it out, his heart lurching. It was a small, rusted locket, its intricate design barely visible beneath the grime. He fumbled it open. Inside, a faded sepia photograph of a young girl, no older than 7, her eyes wide and innocent, yet strangely vacant. As he stared, the single, remaining eye of the porcelain doll he'd first encountered seemed to sharpen, to focus on the locket. The whispering intensified, now a desperate, unified wail. Mine. Panic seized him. This wasn't just old legends. This was real. The woods weren't just taking things. They were keeping them, twisting them, transforming them into their own silent, eternally suffering sentinels. Elias threw the locket, screaming, scrambling to his feet despite the searing pain in his knee. He ran, not caring where, just away from the haunting chorus, away from the thousand staring eyes, away from the chilling realization that he wasn't just lost in the woods, he was found by them. The whispers faded slightly as he burst through the tree line into a small, overgrown clearing, bathed in the sickly glow of a rising, blood-red moon. But before he could savor the momentary reprieve, a single, clear voice, closer than any whisper, floated through the air, directly behind him. It was a child's voice, sweet and forlorn. "Hello, Tracker. Did you find what you were looking for? Because we found you." The sound of dry leaves shuffling began again, closer this time, directly at his heels. Story 2. The Mire's Embrace. The air in the mire was thick, not just with humidity, but with an ancient, cloying scent of decay, a sweet, sickly perfume of drowned things and forgotten time. Liam felt it press against his skin, seeping into his clothes, clinging to his hair. He hadn't meant to venture this deep. His drone, a sleek, expensive piece of equipment, had veered off course, its signal flickering, then dying somewhere amidst the treacherous wetlands. Pride and the hefty price tag had driven him forward, deeper than any sane person would go. Now the sun, a bruised orange disk, was sinking fast, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and stretched like skeletal arms across the waterlogged landscape. Every step was a gamble. The ground beneath the murky water was unpredictable, a shifting mosaic of submerged roots, pockets of quicksand, and sudden, unseen drop-offs. His boots, already caked in a thick, black sludge, squelched with each effortful lift, the sound disturbingly loud in the oppressive silence. The only other sounds were the incessant drone of unseen insects, a high-pitched whine that grated on his nerves, and the distant, guttural croak of a bullfrog, sounding less like an amphibian and more like a warning. He clutched the GPS device, its small screen flickering erratically. The signal was almost non-existent. He was truly alone. He reached a small, slightly elevated hummock of land, barely large enough for him to stand without sinking. Tall, skeletal cypress trees, draped in ghostly Spanish moss, rose from the water around him, their knees protruding like gnomic knuckles. The moss swayed slightly, not with wind, but with an imperceptible current, giving the unnerving impression of slow, deliberate breathing. As darkness fully descended, a primordial fear, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the back of his neck. This wasn't just a swamp. It felt alive, sentient, and malevolent. The shadows deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of light. Liam fumbled for his high-powered flashlight, its beam cutting a stark, almost blinding tunnel through the gloom. He swept it across the water, the light reflecting off the oily surface, revealing a grotesque tapestry of algae and strange, bulbous plants that seemed to pulse faintly in the artificial glow. Then he saw it. Or rather, he thought he did. Just at the edge of the flashlight's reach, something shifted beneath the surface. A ripple too large for a fish, too slow for an alligator. It was like a slow, deliberate undulation. He held his breath, straining his eyes. Nothing, just the water, but the feeling of being watched intensified, an oppressive weight settling on his chest. He shivered, despite the oppressive humidity. He tried to distract himself, pulling out his drone controller, hoping for some miracle signal. The screen remained dark. He sighed, a frustrated, shaky sound that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the hungry darkness. He switched off the flashlight for a moment, conserving battery, and plunged himself into absolute, suffocating blackness. The mire was not just dark. It was a living void, a place where light was an intrusion, unwelcome and swiftly extinguished. That's when he heard it. A whisper, not a whisper of wind or rustling leaves, but something guttural, wet, like a voice struggling through thick mud. "Help me!" It was faint, barely discernible, yet undeniably human. Liam's blood ran cold. He snapped the flashlight back on, sweeping it frantically across the water, heart pounding. Nothing, just the endless, suffocating expanse of the mire. He tried to rationalize it. The wind, perhaps, or his own mind playing tricks in the isolated darkness. But then it came again, clearer this time, closer. Lost. So cold. It sounded like a woman's voice, raspy and choked, filled with an ancient despair. He stumbled forward, driven by a morbid curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need to prove it was nothing. He moved towards the sound, his boots sinking deeper with each step, the viscous mud sucking at his feet with a sickening slurping sound. The whispers grew, merging into a chorus of sorrowful moans and faint, pleading words, all seemingly coming from just beneath the water's surface. "Don't leave. Join us." The beam of his flashlight suddenly caught something in the murky depths, just below the surface. Not a branch or a log. It was a face, pale, distorted, with vacant, staring eyes. It floated just beneath the surface, partially obscured by strands of dark, weed-like hair that swirled around it like a shroud. Its mouth was agape, as if eternally screaming. Liam recoiled, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He shone the light again, his hands trembling so violently the beam danced wildly. There were more, faces, everywhere, peering up from the depths, their pale, bloated forms swaying gently with the unseen currents. Men, women, children, their expressions locked in a silent, agonizing terror. He stumbled backwards, tripping over a submerged root, plunging waist-deep into the frigid water. The cold was shocking, piercing to the bone. As he thrashed, trying to regain his footing, he felt something brush against his leg. Something smooth, yet incredibly strong. Then another and another. They were hands, reaching up from the depths, grasping at his clothing, pulling at his skin. They were surprisingly delicate, yet possessed an unnatural strength, like the slow, relentless pull of a drowning man. He screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure terror, and struggled violently. The water around him began to churn, not from his thrashing, but from the rising forms. Pale, decaying bodies, adorned with the same clinging moss that hung from the cypress trees, began to break the surface. Their eyes, milky and blank, stared directly at him. Their mouths, stretched wide, silently echoed the whispers that now filled the air. 1,000 voices united in a symphony of despair and longing. Stay with us forever. The mire was no longer just a swamp. It was a graveyard, a living tomb, and he was sinking into its embrace. He fought with every ounce of his strength, kicking, flailing, trying to escape the grasping hands. He could feel their cold, clammy touch on his ankles, his thighs, his waist. They were pulling him down, inexorably, into the crushing depths. His lungs burned, screaming for air. The smell of decay was overpowering now, a suffocating shroud that filled his nostrils and throat. He managed to pull one leg free, then the other, mud and ancient water streaming from his boots. He scrambled, desperate, towards the hummock of land he'd just left. The bodies, surprisingly agile in their watery domain, followed, their silent forms gliding through the black water like predatory fish. Their hands reached, long and spectral, their fingers just brushing his heels. He hauled himself onto the hummock, gasping for breath, his muscles screaming. He didn't dare look back. He just scrambled forward, hands and knees tearing on rough bark and sharp stones, driven by a primal, unthinking need to escape. The whispers faded slightly as he gained distance, replaced by the sickening, slurping sounds of the mire closing in on itself behind him, as if consuming the space he had just vacated. He ran, blindly, through the ancient trees, no longer caring about the drone, no longer caring about anything but putting as much distance as possible between himself and the grasping dead. His flashlight beam was weak, flickering, its battery dying. The mire was slowly swallowing its light. He could hear the faint, guttural croak of the bullfrog again, closer this time, and then, distinctly, a soft, wet plop behind him, as if something heavy had just slipped back into the water. He didn't look. He couldn't. He just ran, the mire's icy, suffocating embrace lingering on his skin, a promise of a cold, eternal rest. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he hadn't escaped the mire. He had only delayed his sinking. Story 3. The echoing maw of Blackwood Mine. The wind, a skeletal moan, whistled through the jagged teeth of the mountains surrounding the abandoned Blackwood Mine. It carried with it the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else, something metallic and cold, like forgotten blood on rust. Dr. Alistair Finch cinched his worn parka tighter, the biting air finding every seam. He'd scoffed at the locals' warnings. Tales of miners driven mad, of strange disappearances, of a mine that breathed. Superstitious nonsense he'd rationalized. He was a geologist, a man of science, here to study the peculiar seismic anomalies emanating from deep within the earth, not to chase phantoms. Yet, as the last rays of a sickly, bruised purple dusk bled from the sky, casting the mine's yawning entrance in a truly monstrous shadow, even Alistair felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. His heavy-duty headlamp cut a stark, almost defiant, path into the black maw. The entrance tunnel, shored up by timbers that looked centuries old and warped like arthritic bones, smelled of decay and damp rock. Water seeped from the ceiling in incessant, rhythmic drips, each drop echoing unnaturally in the vast emptiness. He'd packed meticulously geological hammers, rock sample bags, a portable seismic sensor, his tablet for logging data, and enough high-energy rations for 3 days. His rationale was simple. The deepest anomalies were the most intriguing, and a 48-hour solo delve would yield unparalleled data. Now, as the mine swallowed the last of the world outside, the solitude felt less like focus and more like a sentence. He moved cautiously, his boots crunching on loose scree and bits of rotted wood. The air grew heavier, thick with dust and the pervasive scent of minerals. The temperature, surprisingly, began to rise, a stagnant, oppressive warmth that felt unnatural for such a deep cavern. He passed abandoned equipment, rusted or carts on collapsed tracks, pickaxes embedded in walls like ancient sacrifices, their metal gleaming faintly in his lamp's beam. Each artifact seemed to whisper a silent history of forgotten labor and, perhaps, forgotten screams. After what felt like hours, he reached the primary shaft where the main seismic readings had spiked. It was a vast, circular chasm, dropping into an abyss that his lamp couldn't penetrate. He set up his equipment, the gentle hum of the seismic sensor a small, comforting sound in the overwhelming silence. As he calibrated it, he noticed something peculiar. The water dripping from the ceiling here wasn't clear. It was a faint, viscous black, coating the rock walls with an oily sheen. He touched it, bringing his fingers to his nose. It smelled faintly of petroleum, but also something else, something organic and strangely sweet. The seismic sensor began to hum louder, the needle on its small display twitching erratically. Alistair frowned, adjusting the settings. It wasn't just minor tremors. There was a deep, resonant pulse, a rhythm, like a heartbeat. He dismissed it as a malfunction, the mine's natural vibrations. But the feeling of being watched intensified, a palpable pressure on his skin, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. He swept his headlamp around the shaft, its beam swallowed by the vastness. Shadows danced, playing tricks on his eyes, morphing into fleeting shapes in the periphery. Then came the sound. Faint at first, almost imperceptible. A low, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across stone. Alistair froze, heart hammering. He held his breath, straining to hear over his own frantic pulse. The sound came again, closer. Scrape, drag. It was coming from deeper in the shaft, below him. He called out, his voice thin and reedy in the cavernous space. "Hello? Is anyone there?" His words vanished, swallowed by the darkness, leaving only an echoing silence that seemed to mock his fear. He clutched his geological hammer, the cold steel a small comfort. He was alone. It had to be a trick of the acoustics or perhaps a trapped animal. Yet the sound had been too deliberate, too heavy. He took a hesitant step towards the edge of the shaft, shining his light downwards. The beam cut through the inky blackness, revealing only the glistening, wet rock walls. But then, for a split second, he saw it. A glint, a reflection, too large for a mineral deposit, too fluid for water. It was like an eye, vast and dark, reflecting his headlamp for a terrifying, fleeting moment before vanishing into the depths. He stumbled back, gasping, hitting the rock wall behind him. His mind reeled. An eye? Impossible. He was hallucinating, tired and spooked by the isolation. He tried to tell himself that, but the image was seared into his retina. A colossal, unblinking blackness. The scraping sound returned, louder, accompanied now by a wet, sucking noise, as if something immense was pulling itself free from a mire. The air grew colder, despite the mine's earlier warmth. A sudden, chilling draft sweeping up from the abyss below, and with it, a new scent, not rust or damp earth, but something foul, ancient, like a tomb opened after millennia. The seismic sensor shrieked, its needle violently thrashing against the maximum limit. Alistair yanked the plug, silencing its mechanical cries, but the pulse remained. He could feel it now, vibrating through the very rock beneath his feet, a colossal rhythmic throb that resonated deep in his chest. The mine was indeed breathing. A low, guttural rumble emanated from the shaft, a sound that vibrated through his teeth, shaking the ground. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Alistair's eyes darted frantically around the cavern. He had to get out. He grabbed his backpack, abandoning his equipment, the fear now a cold, paralyzing knot in his stomach. He scrambled back the way he came, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly, making the shadows writhe. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the timbers appearing more twisted, more menacing. The dripping water now sounded like mocking laughter, the echoes stretching and distorting. He heard it then, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the air, slithering into his ears. It wasn't words, not exactly, more like a resonant frequency, a vibration that seemed to bypass his eardrums and burrow directly into his skull. It spoke of hunger, of an ancient, insatiable emptiness. He ran, stumbling over loose rock, his breath ragged in his chest. The tunnel narrowed, the ceiling pressing down, threatening to crush him. He could feel the pulse, the heartbeat, growing stronger, directly behind him. The air was thick with the foul, tomb-like odor. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Nothing, only darkness, but the sensation of being pursued was overwhelming. A cold dread that clung to him like a shroud. Then, a new sound. A wet, chitinous scraping, closer this time, accompanied by a sound like 1,000 joints cracking simultaneously. It was coming from the walls themselves. He shone his light, his heart leaping into his throat. The black, oily seepage was no longer just water. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, tendrils of the blackness were extending, reaching out from the cracks in the rock, twisting into grotesque, pseudopod-like forms. They writhed, glistening, coalescing into larger masses that pulsed with an inner, sickly light. These were not just stains. They were living, growing extensions of whatever unspeakable thing pulsed in the depths. And they were reaching for him. Alistair screamed, a raw, desperate sound, and scrambled faster, tearing his parka on jagged rock. The cavern walls seemed to press in, the black tendrils growing with horrifying speed, slithering over the rock, across the ceiling, across the floor, forming a writhing, undulating carpet behind him. He could hear them now, a wet, slurping sound as they moved, like something immense dragging itself through viscera. He burst into a wider section of the tunnel, gasping for air, but the respite was brief. The air here was even thicker, heavier, saturated with the decaying scent. He looked up, and his blood ran cold. Hanging from the ceiling, suspended by thick, rope-like tendrils of the same black, viscous matter, were cocoons. Dozens of them, some small, some man-sized, and from a few, torn and ragged, dangled the remnants of clothing. A miner's faded flannel shirt, a child's worn boot, a woman's shawl. The mine wasn't just consuming, it was preserving. A sudden, sharp tug on his ankle sent him sprawling. He cried out, thrashing. A black tendril, thicker than his arm, had snaked out from a crack in the floor, wrapping around his boot. It was impossibly strong, pulling him back, slowly, inexorably, towards the source of the heartbeat. He dug his fingers into the loose scree, tearing at the rock, but it was useless. The tendril tightened, crushing his ankle. He could hear a low, wet chuckle echoing through the mine now, a sound that wasn't human, but resonated with a chilling, intelligent malice. He yanked his hunting knife from its sheath, its small blade feeling hopelessly inadequate against the monstrous grip. He slashed wildly at the tendril, the blade sinking into the black mass, eliciting no scream, no pain, just a sickening, rubbery give. The tendril twitched, pulling harder, dragging him backwards more rapidly. He could see the opening of the main shaft now, the monstrous chasm he'd just fled. It seemed to shimmer, to breathe with a palpable, hungry anticipation. His headlamp flickered, dying. The world plunged into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing glow emanating from the black tendrils that now completely encased the tunnel walls. He was surrounded, cocooned by the living darkness. He could feel the tendrils brush against his face, soft yet firm, testing him, exploring him. He thrashed, his knife useless, screaming until his throat was raw, but his cries were swallowed by the echoing maw of the mine. The ancient, consuming hunger was upon him. The heartbeat, the pulse, resonated through his very bones, becoming one with his own frantic rhythm. He was no longer Alistair Finch, the geologist. He was merely sustenance. He could feel the tendril at his ankle tightening, pulling him deeper into the Blackwood mine, into the heart of the throbbing, ancient darkness, where the lost were not simply consumed, but absorbed, their essence adding to the collective, insatiable hunger that had awakened beneath the earth. The mine had found its new meal. Story 4. The salt-blasted heart of the lighthouse keeper. Elias Thorne had known loneliness. He'd embraced it, even. A man of quiet solitude. The perpetual roar of the Atlantic and the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam had been his preferred companions for the past decade. The isolated rock known as Widow's Crag, 3 miles off the craggy coast of Maine, was his domain, its lighthouse a sentinel against the relentless sea. It was a life of stark beauty, demanding vigilance, and offering an unparalleled sense of peace, until the fog rolled in. Not the usual sea mist that kissed the waves and softened the horizon, but something else entirely. This was a living, breathing shroud, thick and viscous, that had swallowed the crag whole for a week, blotting out the sun, the stars, and the comforting gleam of the mainland's distant shore. It was a silence, broken only by the mournful bellow of the foghorn, that pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. The isolation, once his solace, had begun to fray at the edges of his composure. The lamp, a powerful Fresnel lens, cast its sweeping light into the impenetrable gray, finding nothing but an endless, swirling void. Elias, a man of meticulous routine, found himself checking the mechanisms more often, polishing already gleaming brass with obsessive vigor. The salt spray, a constant presence, no longer felt invigorating. It felt like a cold, clammy touch, a precursor to something unseen. It started subtly, like a pebble dropped into a deep well, sending out ripples that slowly reached the shore. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of ozone, even when there was no storm. The distant, barely audible clang of metal on metal, a sound that Elias, the sole occupant of the lighthouse, knew shouldn't exist. He'd dismiss it as the settling of old iron, the groaning of the structure against the relentless battering of the sea. But the logical explanations felt thin, fragile against the mounting unease in his gut. Then came the whispers. They weren't distinct words, more like a collective sigh carried on the air, just beyond the reach of understanding. They seemed to rise with the tide, cresting with the incoming waves, then receding with the ebb, leaving behind a chilling silence that was almost worse than the whispers themselves. Elias found himself stopping mid-sentence, cocking his head, straining to hear. He'd paced the lantern room, pressing his ear to the thick glass, as if the fog itself held secrets it was struggling to release. He was accustomed to the sea's voice, its myriad moods, but this was different. This was a chorus of grief, a lament that echoed something profound and ancient. He found himself avoiding the lower levels of the lighthouse, particularly the old storage room beneath the spiral staircase. It was always damp, filled with the scent of mildew and decaying rope, but now there was a new, unsettling chill that emanated from it, even in the oppressive humidity of the fog. One evening, while retrieving a spare fuel canister, he noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible outline on the stone wall, near the floor. It looked like a handprint, small and smudged, as if someone had pressed a grimy palm against the cold rock. He wiped at it, but it remained, stubbornly etched into the stone. His blood ran cold. He was the only one on the crag. No ships had called, no boats had come near in days. He tried to shake off the growing dread. The isolation was getting to him, that was all. He was imagining things, hallucinations born of solitude and the oppressive fog. He forced himself to go through his routines, to perform the mundane tasks that grounded him. He polished the lens until his arms ached. He meticulously checked the fuel lines. He recorded the weather data with unnerving precision. But the whispers intensified, sometimes coalescing into what sounded like a name or part of one. Eleanor, or lost. The clang of metal on metal became more frequent, more distinct. It sounded like chains, dragging across the stone floors of the lighthouse's lower levels. Elias would grip the railing of the spiral staircase, heart pounding, listening. He'd tell himself it was the wind, the heavy chains from the old davits outside rattling in some unseen gust. But the fog lay still, heavy and unwavering. There was no wind. One night, a piercing shriek ripped through the silence, echoing up the lighthouse shaft, chilling him to the bone. It was undeniably human, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and agony. Elias froze, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. He stood rigid in the lantern room, the beam sweeping out into the blank fog, his mind racing. He was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. He grabbed the old maritime flare gun, its cold metal a small comfort in his trembling hand. He forced himself to descend the spiral stairs, his boots clanking loudly in the unnatural silence, each step an effort of will. The air grew colder with every floor he descended, the smell of decay becoming more pronounced. He reached the bottom, the generator room humming faintly, the only sound apart from his own ragged breathing. He shone his powerful lantern beam into the shadows, searching every corner. Nothing, just the rusted machinery, the stored equipment. And then he saw it. On the stone floor, near the wall, a single small puddle of dark, viscous liquid. It wasn't water. It was too thick, too dark. It smelled faintly of salt and something else, something deeply organic, metallic. Blood. His knees almost buckled. He backed away slowly, his eyes glued to the horrifying stain. As he retreated, his foot kicked something. He shone the light down. A small, tarnished silver locket lay on the floor. He picked it up with trembling fingers. It was cold, heavy. He fumbled it open. Inside, a faded, sepia photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a melancholic smile. And on the opposite side, etched neatly the name Eleanor. The whispers suddenly erupted into a cacophony, surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. They were louder now, clearer, filled with desperate pleas and weeping. "Eleanor!" they cried. "Taken! Lost to the sea!" The clanging of chains intensified, closer now, just beyond the thin door leading to the old storage room. A chilling draft swept through the generator room, extinguishing the flickering fluorescent light, plunging him into oppressive darkness, illuminated only by his headlamp. He slammed the locket shut, the name Eleanor screaming in his mind. He knew the stories. The lighthouse had claimed many lives over the centuries. Sailors dashed on the rocks, supply ships lost in storms. But there was one particularly tragic legend. Eleanor Vance, a young woman, the daughter of a former keeper, who had vanished during a terrible storm a century ago, her body never found. They said she had been dragged from the crag by something unseen, swallowed by the vengeful sea. A guttural thud resonated from the storage room, followed by a wet, scraping sound. The door, warped and ancient, began to creak open, slowly, inexorably. Elias aimed the flare gun, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He could hear something breathing on the other side, a slow, ragged intake of air that felt impossibly vast. As the door opened wider, revealing only deeper, shifting darkness, a chill unlike any he had ever known swept through the room, cutting him to the bone. And from the blackness, 2 points of pale, milky light slowly appeared, hovering in the void. They were eyes, immensely large, unblinking, reflecting his headlamp with a horrifying, ancient wisdom and profound, unending sorrow. They seemed to stare directly into his soul, not with malice, but with an insatiable longing. The whispers intensified, becoming a chilling chorus that filled his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. They spoke of the deep, of cold currents, of eternal darkness, of being held, trapped, consumed. "She's here. We're all here. You belong to the sea now." From the darkness beyond the eyes, a form began to coalesce, slowly, ponderously. It was vast, indistinct, yet undeniably there, shifting and swaying like kelp in an unseen current. It seemed to be made of shadows and the very fabric of the deep, its shape vaguely humanoid, impossibly tall, limbs trailing away into the gloom. And from it, a faint, sickly luminescence emanated, revealing fleeting glimpses of other forms, smaller, indistinct, swirling within its masked faces, limbs, entangled within the larger entity. The souls of the drowned, perhaps, or something far worse, something that collected the lost. Elias fired the flare gun. The bright, searing light erupted from the barrel, illuminating the monstrous figure for a horrifying, crystalline moment. It was a ghastly mosaic of drowned bodies, entangled with seaweed and fishing nets, their faces pale and distorted, their vacant eyes staring out from the collective horror. Eleanor's face, recognizable from the locket, was among them, her mouth agape in a silent scream, her form partially submerged within the larger entity. The flare hit the thing, exploding in a shower of sparks and blinding light. The creature recoiled with a sound that wasn't a scream but a deep, mournful rumble, like the groan of a dying leviathan. The temperature plummeted, the air filling with the metallic scent of ozone and the overwhelming stench of the deep sea, of death and salt and things that had never seen the light. Elias didn't wait. He turned and bolted, scrambling up the spiral staircase, taking 3 steps at a time, his legs screaming in protest. The whispers pursued him, echoing up the shaft, filled with renewed anger and a desperate longing. The dragging sound returned, accompanied by wet thuds against the stone walls, as if the monstrous entity was pulling itself up the lighthouse, its countless submerged limbs reaching for him. He burst into the lantern room, gasping, collapsing against the polished brass railing. The powerful light beam continued its sweep into the dense fog, a beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. He stared out, desperate, for any sign of the mainland, any hint of escape. The fog, however, seemed to have thickened, pressing against the glass with a palpable weight. Suddenly, a massive, wet thud shook the entire lighthouse. The structure groaned, the glass in the lantern room vibrating violently. Elias spun around. On the observation deck, just outside the lantern room, a monstrous hand, vast and dripping with seawater and tangled kelp, was slowly emerging from the dense fog, its fingers curling around the railing, the wood groaning and splintering under its immense pressure. It was not a single hand. It was a cluster of arms, pale and bloated, bound together by ropes of seaweed, forming a single collective limb of the drowned. The creature was climbing. It was coming for him. Its vast, milky eyes, now closer, stared through the glass, radiating an ancient sorrow and a chilling hunger. Elias scrambled towards the emergency axe, kept for breaking glass in a fire. He seized it, his hands slick with sweat. He knew with a terrifying certainty that this was not a hallucination, not a trick of the mind. This was the salt-blasted heart of the crag, the collective soul of the lost, returned to claim its due. He swung the axe, not at the glass, but at the mechanisms of the lamp, desperate to plunge the lighthouse into darkness, to hide, to simply make the beacon stop. He knew it was futile. The thing was already here. Its other hand, equally monstrous, began to appear, grasping the railing, slowly pulling itself higher. The lighthouse trembled, groaning under the immense weight. The whispers filled the lantern room, no longer pleading, but commanding, possessive. Join us, Keeper. Become part of the light, part of the dark, part of the sea. The glass of the lantern room began to crack, spiderwebbing outwards from where the creature's immense, composite face was slowly pressing against it, its thousands of constituent drowned faces contorted in silent agony and ravenous longing. Elias stood paralyzed, the axe forgotten in his hand. He looked into the abyssal depths of its eyes, and in them, he saw the horrifying truth. This creature was not just a monster. It was a manifestation of every soul lost to these waters, their collective despair and hunger given form. And it was here to add him to its eternal, watery embrace. The fog pressed in, thick and suffocating, wrapping around the lighthouse like a burial shroud, as the glass finally gave way with a deafening shriek of tearing metal and shattering light. The sound of the waves, once a comfort, now sounded like 1,000 hungry mouths consuming the very air. Story 4. The static in the walls of Blackwood Asylum. The silence of Blackwood Asylum was not empty. It was a vast, heavy presence, thick with the dust of forgotten screams and the lingering scent of antiseptic overlaid with decay. Sarah, a hardened urban explorer whose online handle, Urban Echoes, belied her nervous disposition, nudged open the splintered double doors. They groaned like tortured souls, grating against the debris-strewn floor. A gust of wind, oddly warm and fetid, sighed from within, carrying with it the whisper of rusted metal and crumbling plaster. Her powerful headlamp cut a stark tunnel through the gloom, illuminating a grand, yet utterly derelict, reception hall. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from the vaulted ceilings, catching the light like spectral lace. A discarded wheelchair lay on its side, a mummified for drip still attached to its frame, casting a skeletal shadow. This was it, the infamous Blackwood Asylum. Legend said it never truly emptied. The patients and their tormentors simply faded into the walls, their suffering an eternal resonance. Sarah had come for the echoes. She clutched her professional-grade camera, its weight a familiar comfort, though her hands trembled slightly. Her goal, viral content. The internet craved the macabre, and Blackwood, with its history of controversial therapies and rumored disappearances, was a goldmine. She'd researched its past meticulously. Dr. Alistair Finch, the asylum superintendent, a brilliant but increasingly unhinged physician who believed in cleansing the mind through extreme sensory deprivation and invasive psychosurgery. The stories of screaming patients and flickering lights had been dismissed as urban myth. But standing here, in the cold, unbreathing stillness, the myths felt disturbingly real. She moved deeper, her boots crunching on fallen plaster and broken glass. The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with doors most ajar, revealing empty, decaying rooms. Each room felt colder than the last, a damp, pervasive chill that seeped into her bones. She recorded everything, narrating in a hushed, reverent tone for her unseen audience. And here, ladies and gentlemen, we have Ward C, infamous for. Her voice, usually confident, wavered, thin and fragile against the asylum's oppressive silence. As she passed a particularly decrepit room, she caught a glimpse of something in her peripheral vision. A flicker, just beyond the reach of her headlamp, in the deepest shadow. She spun, shining her light directly into the room. Nothing, just an empty bed frame, springs exposed like rusted teeth, and peeling wallpaper that depicted faded, pastoral scenes. A cruel irony for the souls who suffered here. She dismissed it as her eyes playing tricks, a common occurrence in low light. But the oppressive feeling intensified, a sensation of being watched, scrutinized. She reached what was once the recreation room. A grand piano lay overturned, its keys shattered, strings resembling the exposed nerves of some mechanical beast. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated in the air, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Sarah frowned, testing the air. It wasn't the hum of machinery. It was something deeper, more organic, like a vast electrical current running just beneath the surface of reality. She began to call it the static. Hours passed. The sun had long set, plunging the outside world into darkness, leaving Sarah utterly isolated within Blackwood's grim embrace. She found the administrative offices, a chaotic mess of overturned desks and scattered papers. Dust motes danced in her headlamp's beam, making the air feel alive. She sifted through the decaying documents, her heart giving a nervous flutter when she found a patient ledger, its leather cover cracked and brittle. Names, dates, diagnoses scribbled in fading ink. And then, at the bottom of a page, a chilling entry, Patient 734, persistent vocalizations, treatment, experimental sensory isolation. Outcome, disappeared. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from deeper within the asylum. It sounded like a metal tray dropped on a tiled floor. Sarah jumped, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't alone. Her mind, usually so logical, scrambled for an explanation. Vandals? Homeless people? No. The doors had been sealed, the pathways overgrown. She was the only one who could have entered. The static in the walls intensified, a buzzing vibration that she could now feel in her teeth. It was growing louder, more insistent, like 1,000 hidden radios struggling to tune into a single, terrifying frequency. A cold spot formed directly behind her, raising goosebumps on her arms. She spun, her headlamp cutting through the darkness, finding nothing. But the feeling of a presence was overwhelming, a cold breath on her neck. She had to see. Driven by morbid curiosity and the primal thrill of fear, she followed the sound of the clang. It led her deeper, to a section of the asylum she hadn't explored yet, the experimental wing. According to a faded sign above an archway, the air here was even colder, thick with the pervasive smell of rust and something acrid, chemical. The corridor was narrower, darker, the walls lined with heavy, steel doors, most sealed shut. She came to a door that was slightly ajar, a sliver of oppressive blackness within. The faint clang had seemed to come from here. She pushed it open slowly, revealing a small, padded room. The walls were stained with unidentifiable dark marks, and a single, rusted chair stood bolted to the floor in the center, its leather straps hanging like grotesque ribbons. This was a restraint room, and on the floor beside the chair, glinting faintly, was a single tarnished metal tray. The clang. It had to be a coincidence. The wind, but the room felt wrong. It radiated a profound despair, a silent scream frozen in time. As she shone her light around, she noticed something disturbing. On the padded wall, scrawled in what looked like dried, dark fluid, was a crude drawing. A stick figure, arms outstretched, its head a frantic scribble of lines. And beneath it, a single, repeated word, scratched deeply into the padding, "See me." The static in the walls exploded into a deafening roar. a cacophony of white noise and distorted whispers. It was no longer a hum. It was 1,000 tortured voices, all speaking at once, indistinguishable yet terrifyingly clear in their collective anguish. Sarah clapped her hands over her ears, gritting her teeth, her head pounding. The room seemed to pulse, the very air vibrating with the unseen presence. The chair in the center of the room began to rock, slowly at first, then with increasing violence. The leather straps snapped taut, then loose, snapping against the metal frame. Sarah stumbled back, horrified, her heart seizing in her chest. This was not the wind. This was not her imagination. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute darkness, save for the beam of her headlamp, which now seemed impossibly fragile. The static intensified, swirling around her, seeming to press against her eardrums. A cold, skeletal hand brushed against her cheek. She screamed, a primal sound of terror, and thrashed wildly, swinging her camera like a weapon. She could feel breath on her neck, hear a wet, ragged gasp directly behind her. She fumbled for the door, tearing at the cold steel handle. It was locked, trapped. The whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice, thin and reedy, yet filled with an ancient, unbearable pain. He didn't want us to see, but we see everything now. The room, now devoid of light except for her headlamp, began to flicker. Not the lamp itself, but the room. The stained walls seemed to shift, the shadows lengthening and contracting with impossible speed. Figures, translucent and fleeting, began to appear in her peripheral vision, emaciated forms strapped to chairs, their mouths agape in silent screams. They were the patients, trapped, enduring their treatments for eternity. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, her voice cracking. The static was a physical force now, pushing against her, suffocating her. The cold hand was on her arm, its grip surprisingly firm, pulling her towards the chair. She fought, kicked, but the strength of the unseen entity was overwhelming. She could feel invisible straps tightening around her wrists, her ankles, binding her to the rusted chair. A horrifying realization dawned on her. This wasn't just a haunting. They weren't just echoes. They were reliving their torment, and they needed a vessel. They needed someone to be subjected to the treatments once more, to experience the agony for them. And Alistair Finch's spirit, or something far worse, was still here, guiding them, continuing his work. The whispers spoke of blinding light, of crushing silence, of the eradication of thought. The padded room, once a place of torment, was becoming her tomb. The static in the walls wasn't just background noise. It was the combined, amplified consciousness of every soul that had been broken here, seeking release through another's suffering. She could feel the essence of their pain seeping into her, a cold, sharp blade twisting in her mind. A blinding white light erupted from the ceiling, originating from no visible source, engulfing the room. It was not a comforting light. It was harsh, searing, burning into her retinas. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the light penetrated, searing the inside of her eyelids, filling her vision with a blinding, agonizing void. The static shrieked, an unbearable symphony of torment. She heard a low, raspy chuckle, closer now, directly in front of her. The cleansing begins. It was the voice of Dr. Finch, distorted, echoing, yet undeniably his. She felt something cold and sharp press against her temple, then a piercing pain. Not physical pain, but something deeper, more insidious. It was as if her thoughts were being plucked, one by one, from her mind, leaving behind gaping, empty voids. Memories of her life, her family, her name, they were dissolving, unraveling like frayed threads. She struggled, but the invisible restraints held fast. The light intensified, burning away her very identity. The static roared, and through it, she heard the chorus of whispers, no longer mournful, but triumphant. One of us, one of us. The asylum wasn't just haunted. It was a sentient entity, feeding on the minds and souls of those it trapped, recreating the horrors of its past with chilling, surgical precision. her mind fractured, her thoughts scattering like dust in a gale. The pain was unbearable, yet it was not a pain of the body, but of the spirit, of the very essence of her being torn asunder. She felt a profound emptiness, a chilling void where her memories had been. She was no longer Sarah. She was a vessel, a blank slate, ready to be filled with the echoes of Blackwood. The light began to fade, slowly, mercifully. When it was gone, the static in the walls subsided, returning to a low, pervasive hum. The air in the padded room settled, the oppressive chill receding. The straps, she realized, were gone. She was free. She opened her eyes, blinking into the gloom. The room was empty. The chair, the stains, the etched message, all gone. It was just a bare, cold room, its walls painted a dull, sickly green. She stood, swaying, her mind a blank. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. She felt a profound sense of disorientation, a terrifying emptiness where herself should have been. She couldn't remember her name. She couldn't remember why she was here. She felt a vague sense of unease, a familiar chill, but no specific fear. She stumbled out of the room, into the long, silent corridor. The hum in the walls was constant now, a comforting presence, like a lullaby. She noticed a faint light emanating from one of the previously sealed steel doors. She walked towards it, drawn by an irresistible urge. The door creaked open, revealing a small, sterile operating theater. A surgical table stood in the center, gleaming faintly in the dim light. And on the table, a single, pristine surgical tool, a shining, intricate device, its purpose unsettlingly unclear. She picked it up, her fingers closing around the cold metal. Felt, right, familiar even. A profound sense of purpose filled her. She looked at her reflection in the polished surface of the tool. Her eyes were empty, yet held a strange, knowing glint. Her lips curved into a faint, unsettling smile. She heard the whispers again, clearer this time, not in her ears, but inside her very being. He's ready. The next patient is ready. She looked around the empty operating theater, then back at the instrument in her hand. A faint, almost imperceptible image flickered in her mind. A patient, strapped to the table, their eyes wide with terror, and a voice resonating with cold precision. The cleansing begins. It was her voice, or rather, the voice that now spoke through her. Blackwood Asylum hadn't just tormented its patients. It had consumed its tormentors too, absorbing their methods, their madness, passing them on. Sarah, the urban explorer, had not found echoes. She had become one, and the asylum, breathing its static lullaby, was ready for its next treatment. She looked forward to it with a chilling, clinical anticipation. Story 5: The Labyrinth of Whispering Pines. Ben had chased rumors his entire life. Whispers of unmapped caves, lost valleys, and flora thought extinct. His camera, a heavy, familiar weight against his chest, had been his constant companion, his lens a window to the unseen. But the rumors surrounding the deepest, most restricted sector of the Blackwood National Forest, Sector Gamma, were different. They spoke not of rare species or geological anomalies, but of impossible silence, shifting landscapes, and people who simply walked in and never walked out. Dismissed by park rangers as hyperbole and by scientists as folklore, these tales had a chilling resonance that gnawed at Ben, an ancient, primordial dread, almost a calling. And Ben, a man who believed only what he saw through his viewfinder, was compelled to see. He'd spent weeks mapping old logging trails, cross-referencing faded topographical maps with satellite imagery. The entrance to Sector Gamma wasn't marked. It was merely where the meticulously maintained trails abruptly vanished, swallowed by a wall of impossibly dense, towering pine trees. They stood like silent, grim sentinels, their needles a perpetually damp, earthy carpet that muffled all sound. The air beneath their boughs was heavy, still, carrying the scent of rich, dark soil, decaying pine needles, and something else, something faintly metallic, like static electricity on a stormy night, a scent that prickled at the back of his throat. He pushed through the last barrier of thorny brush, his heavy pack snagging. The silence that descended upon him was profound, unnerving. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an active negation of it. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, no chirping insects. Even the distant hum of civilization seemed to be absorbed, devoured by the oppressive stillness. His own breath felt loud, his heart a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming vacuum. This was the heart of Sector Gamma. He consulted his GPS. It flickered erratically, then displayed a no-signal message. He frowned, tapping the screen. Unlikely, but possible. He pulled out his compass. The needle spun wildly, dancing a frantic, meaningless jig before settling, not on north, but pointing erratically towards a dense thicket of trees. Another anomaly. He relied on his experience, his innate sense of direction, honed over decades in the wilderness. He pushed forward, deeper into the labyrinth of whispering pines. The trees themselves were ancient, their trunks impossibly thick, their lowest branches tangled and interwoven, forming a canopy so dense that only slivers of bruised, dying light pierced through. The ground was uneven, covered in a thick layer of needles and gnarled roots that seemed to writhe like submerged serpents. He noticed something unsettling. The trees seemed to shift. Not literally, of course, but the angles, the spaces between them, seemed to subtly reconfigure themselves as he walked, denying him a clear path, constantly forcing him to adjust, to reevaluate. It was disorienting, like trying to navigate a maze that rearranged itself with every step. He pressed on, determined. His camera clicked, capturing the oppressive beauty, the haunting stillness. He shot panoramic views, close-ups of strange fungi, the way the limited light painted spectral patterns on the ancient bark. But as the hours passed, and the perpetual twilight of the forest deepened into an early, oppressive night, a gnawing unease began to settle in his gut. He should have seen some landmarks, a distinct rock formation, a broken branch, anything. But every tree looked the same, every thicket identical, leading him into an endless, repeating pattern. He decided to make camp, pulling out his lightweight tent. The air grew colder, and the metallic scent intensified, almost burning his nostrils. As he hammered in a tent peg, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It wasn't wind. There was no breeze. It was a dry, rustling sound, like parchment rubbing against stone, emanating from the forest itself. It seemed to coil around him, 1,000 barely audible voices, too indistinct to form words, yet undeniably present. He stopped, holding his breath, straining to hear. Nothing, only the blood thrumming in his ears. He tried to rationalize it. Exhaustion, isolation, the mind playing tricks. He forced down some cold rations, the taste like ash in his mouth. He crawled into his sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. The whispers returned, growing louder, more insistent, a chorus of faint, dry rustlings that seemed to coil around his tent. He could feel the trees, vast and ancient, pressing in on him, their unseen presence palpable. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he wasn't just in a forest. He was in something ancient and aware. He snapped awake in the pre-dawn gloom, his body stiff, his mind foggy. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. He checked his supplies. His water bottle was half empty, though he swore he'd filled it. He dismissed it as an oversight. He packed up, his movements sluggish, his sense of direction now completely compromised. He had to pick a direction and stick to it. North. He pointed his body, despite his compass's erratic behavior, and began to walk. The forest twisted around him, mocking his attempts at navigation. Paths he swore he'd just taken vanished, replaced by impenetrable walls of ancient growth. Trees he'd just passed would reappear ahead of him, identical, unervingly familiar. He found himself walking in circles, trapped in a horrifying, living labyrinth. The whispers returned, clearer now, less like rustling, more like voices. Words, faint and distorted, barely audible. Lost, so lost. They seemed to hiss, carried on the stagnant air. He stumbled upon a clearing he distinctly remembered from his research. A small, circular space, oddly devoid of pines, surrounded by taller, darker trees. In the center, a rough, monolithic stone, covered in intricate, weathered carvings. He'd seen photos of it, believed to be an ancient ceremonial site. He moved towards it, his camera raised, a professional instinct overriding his growing dread. As he approached, the air grew incredibly cold, the metallic scent overwhelming. He could feel the static in the air, buzzing around him like a swarm of unseen insects. He touched the stone. It was impossibly cold, despite the rising temperature of the day. The carvings felt strange beneath his fingertips, not smooth, but slightly concave, as if worn down by countless touches. As his fingers traced the ancient symbols, a jolt, like static electricity, shot up his arm. His vision blurred. The world around him twisted, the trees seeming to spin, their branches reaching, grasping. And then he saw them, translucent figures, indistinct and shimmering, coalescing around the stone. They were human-shaped but warped, elongated, their limbs too long, their heads too small. Their faces were featureless, yet radiated a profound, silent agony. They appeared to be struggling, writhing, as if bound to the air itself. And from their spectral forms, the whispers emanated, a terrifying chorus that filled his mind, bypassed his ears, resonating directly in his skull. Trapped, cannot leave, memory, gone. Ben stumbled back, horrified, tearing his hand from the stone. The figures vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence, the shifting trees, and the overwhelming sense of having witnessed something impossible. He was losing his mind. The forest was doing this to him. It was feeding on his sanity, twisting his perception. He ran, blindly, no longer caring about direction, just away from the stone, away from the whispers, away from the terrifying realization that he was prey. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches forming a constricting tunnel. The ground became impossibly soft, sucking at his boots, pulling him down. He was running through what felt like thick, decaying mud, yet there was no visible water. The scent of pine was replaced by something foul, like stagnant swamp water mixed with something metallic. He crashed through a curtain of thick, hanging moss, stumbling into a new, terrifying part of the forest. Here, the trees were even older, their trunks covered in a strange, bioluminescent moss that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. And hanging from their branches, entangled in thick, fibrous webs, were objects. Backpacks, water bottles, torn pieces of clothing, and then human remains. Not skeletons, but mummified, shriveled forms, suspended like grotesque fruit. Their faces were contorted in silent screams, their eyes wide and empty. These were the missing, the ones who walked in and never walked out. He retched, while burning his throat. The whispers intensified, not from the mummified bodies, but from the glowing moss, from the very trees themselves. Consumed, one by one, become us. The static in the air became unbearable, a high-pitched whine that threatened to burst his eardrums. He could feel it pressing on his skull, trying to force its way in. He saw his own reflection in the moss, distorted, stretched, his eyes wide with fear. But then the reflection shifted. It wasn't his face anymore. It was another, older face, gaunt and terrified, its features strangely familiar. He remembered a news report years ago about a lone hiker who vanished in Blackwood. His mind was slipping. The forest was not just consuming bodies. It was devouring minds, weaving them into its collective consciousness, adding their despair to its endless hum. He staggered forward, his movements uncoordinated, his mind a battlefield of fractured thoughts and alien memories. He felt a profound sense of loss, a chilling emptiness where his own identity should have been. He was becoming one of them. He could hear the whispers inside his own head now, not just from the trees, but from within his own consciousness. They were his memories, his fears, his very essence, being slowly, relentlessly absorbed. He tripped, falling heavily. As he tried to push himself up, his hands sank into the soft, yielding ground. It wasn't dirt. It was a vast, living mycelial network, pulsating faintly with the same sickly green light as the moss on the trees. Tendrils, thin and fibrous, began to snake out from the ground, wrapping around his wrists, his ankles, pulling him down into the soft, yielding earth. He screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The static shrieked in his mind, drowning out all else. The trees around him seemed to grow taller, their branches intertwining, sealing off the sky. The mummified bodies above swayed, their empty eyes fixed on him. He could feel the fibrous tendrils burrowing into his skin, searching for something, consuming something. His memories, his consciousness. A final, terrifying realization bloomed in his disintegrating mind. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a single, vast, ancient organism, and the whispers were its thoughts, the static its very being. It had been drawing people in for centuries, not to kill them, but to absorb them, to add their minds, their experiences, their very souls to its colossal collective consciousness. And now it was his turn. He felt a profound sense of peace, a terrifying serenity as his own identity dissolved, merging with the endless hum. His fear faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of belonging, of being part of something vast and ancient. His last thought, a flicker before it, too, was consumed, was a single, chilling whisper that was no longer his own, but the forest's. "Welcome home!" The tendrils pulled him deeper, slowly, inexorably, into the yielding, living earth. His camera, dropped beside him, became covered in the glowing moss, its lens reflecting a faint, sickly green light. Another echo, another part of the labyrinth. The whispers in the forest intensified for a moment, a satisfied sigh from the ancient, consuming consciousness. The labyrinth of whispering pines had claimed another, and the static in its walls grew just a little bit stronger. Story 6. The Deep Hum of Tide's Edge. Dr. Evelyn Reed had always been drawn to the hidden currents of history, the untold narratives that festered beneath the veneer of progress. Her latest project, a comprehensive study of obscure coastal folklore, had led her to Tide's Edge, a remote fishing village clinging precariously to a jagged promontory on the furthest reaches of the Canadian Maritimes. The village was an anachronism, a cluster of weathered clapboard houses huddled against the relentless Atlantic, perpetually shrouded in a dense, chilling fog that rolled in from the abyss. Local legends spoke of the deep hum, a low-frequency vibration said to emanate from beneath the sea, and of the town's uncanny resistance to the passage of time, its remarkably few residents, and the occasional unexplained disappearance of outsiders. Evelyn, a pragmatic historian, dismissed these as quaint local color. She was here for the archives, the old maritime logs, the forgotten diaries. But as her rented sedan coughed its last breath at the edge of the single, salt-worn road leading into Tide's Edge, a prickle of unease, cold and sharp, traced its way up her spine. The fog was thick and cloying, tasting of salt and ancient damp. It swallowed the sparse sunlight, plunging the village into a perpetual twilight. The air was heavy, humid, yet carried an unnatural chill. There was no sound but the mournful, distant groan of a foghorn and the relentless sigh of the unseen ocean. The village itself seemed eerily quiet, almost deserted. Houses sat shuttered, their windows like vacant eyes. A single, weathered general store, its paint peeling like sunburned skin, stood as the only sign of life. She found the local B&B, run by a woman named Martha, whose smile was too wide, too fixed, and whose eyes, a startling pale blue, seemed to hold an unnerving depth. Martha bustled, offering her freshly baked bread that tasted oddly of brine, and a room with a window overlooking the churning gray sea. Evelyn noticed the faint, almost imperceptible vibration in the floorboards. The deep hum, she mused, a geological anomaly, perhaps. She tried to rationalize the faint, rhythmic pulse she felt in her teeth. Her first few days were productive, if unsettling. The village archives, housed in a small, damp building near the docks, were a treasure trove of handwritten logs and faded photographs. She pored over them, tracing family lineages, noting odd recurring phrases: the great silence, the offering, the deepening. She also noticed a peculiar consistency. The population never seemed to grow or shrink significantly, despite the apparent isolation. More unsettling, some names, particularly of those listed as having moved away, vanished from subsequent records entirely, as if they had never existed. The locals were polite, but reserved. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversations often punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. They never met her gaze directly, their eyes always seeming to drift towards the sea or towards the ever-present fog. She tried to ask about the disappearances, about the deep hum. Martha's smile would tighten, her eyes would flicker, and she'd quickly change the subject to the weather or the meager fish catch. The fishermen, with their weather-beaten faces and calloused hands, would simply shake their heads, mumbling about the ocean's ways. The hum itself became more pronounced. It wasn't just a vibration in the floorboards. It was a resonance, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to fill the very air, vibrating in her chest, rattling the glassware in her room. It intensified at night, sometimes accompanied by a faint, clicking sound, like countless tiny segments rubbing against each other, deep beneath the waves. She tried to record it with her portable audio recorder, but the device only captured white noise. Yet, she could feel it, an insistent, ancient pulse that seemed to permeate the very fabric of Tide's Edge. One evening, as she sat in her room, typing up notes, she saw it. Her reflection in the window was distorted, stretched, her features subtly alien. She blinked, and it was gone, replaced by her normal image. A trick of the light, she told herself, but the memory lingered, a chill in her gut. Later, she found a small, ornate silver locket on her nightstand. She knew it wasn't hers. She opened it. Inside, a faded sepia photograph of a young woman with Martha's pale blue eyes, but her expression was one of profound, silent terror. The locket was cold, heavy, radiating a strange, almost imperceptible warmth. She put it aside, determined to ask Martha about it, but a creeping sense of unease made her hesitate. The next morning, the locket was gone, and her research notes, meticulously organized, were subtly rearranged. A particular old map, showing uncharted deep-sea trenches just off the coast, was open to a page she swore she'd closed. It felt less like a prank and more like a deliberate, unseen hand. The fog had thickened, pressing against the windows like a vast, unblinking eye. The foghorn's mournful bellow was constant now, a lonely cry swallowed by the endless gray. The scent of ozone, like before a violent storm, permeated the air, mixed with the pervasive salt and something new, something metallic and sickly sweet, like rust and decaying seaweed. That night, the deep hum became a roaring crescendo. It wasn't just a vibration. It was a sound, a low, guttural throb that shook the entire B&B, rattling the foundations. The clicking sound intensified, rapid and insistent, accompanied by a wet, slurping noise, like something vast and viscous moving just beneath the earth. Evelyn scrambled out of bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her ear to the floorboards. The sounds were directly beneath her, a frantic, rhythmic churning. She heard movement downstairs, voices, hushed, fervent whispers. She crept to her door, peering through the crack. Martha was there, her pale blue eyes wide and vacant, leading a small procession of villagers. They moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, their faces expressionless, their forms almost translucent in the dim, fog-filtered light. They carried objects: a fisherman's net, a coil of thick rope, and a single, freshly baked loaf of bread, impossibly large and glistening with brine. They were heading out towards the docks, towards the sea. Evelyn grabbed her coat and flashlight, the old locket from her previous room now somehow in her pocket. She followed them, keeping to the shadows, her every nerve screaming for her to run in the opposite direction. The fog was a living entity now, swirling around her, muffling her footsteps, guiding her. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic, sweet stench. The deep hum was deafening, vibrating through the very ground. They reached the edge of the oldest, most derelict pier, its timbers slick with algae and ancient salt. The sea beneath was not black, but a deep, unsettling indigo, almost purple, shimmering with a faint, internal luminescence. The fog pressed down, forming a suffocating dome around them. The villagers stopped at the edge of the pier, forming a semicircle. Martha stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a mask of serene emptiness. She began to chant, her voice low and monotonous, the words ancient, guttural, echoing eerily in the fog. It was not a language Evelyn recognized, but it resonated with a horrifying familiarity, a primal fear that burrowed into her soul. As Martha chanted, the indigo water beneath the pier began to churn, not from waves, but from a profound disturbance from below. The luminescence intensified, revealing something vast and indistinct moving in the depths. It wasn't a creature. It was a shape-shifting mass, like liquid shadow, tentacles of pure darkness unfurling, slowly, ponderously, from the abyss. They seemed to ripple with a faint internal light, and embedded within their viscous forms, Evelyn could glimpse fleeting shapes. Human faces, elongated limbs, twisted forms, all struggling silently within the mass. The missing, the ones who had moved away. The deep hum intensified, a deafening roar that vibrated through Evelyn's bones, threatening to shatter her eardrums. It was not a sound, but a feeling of profound, ancient hunger, an insatiable emptiness radiating from the mass below. The clicking sounds became a frenzy, like giant mandibles clacking, teeth grinding. Martha raised the loaf of bread, her expression beatific, almost ecstatic. She spoke a final word in the ancient tongue. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, she broke the bread, sprinkling crumbs onto the churning water. The tentacles below pulsed, seemed to writhe with renewed vigor, reaching upwards. And then, from the depths of the indigo mass, a single, impossibly pale arm emerged, delicate yet powerful, adorned with intricate, silvery scales. Its fingers were long, slender, almost elegant, and clasped in its palm was another locket, identical to the one Evelyn had found, but glinting with a fresh, unsettling sheen. The arm extended towards Martha. The villagers, their faces now contorted in a horrifying mask of adoration and fear, chanted louder, their voices rising to a fever pitch. Martha reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, scaly skin of the arm. And then, slowly, inexorably, the arm pulled her. She didn't resist. Her fixed smile remained on her face, even as she was drawn forward, her feet leaving the pier, her body slowly sinking into the churning, glowing indigo mass. The water closed over her head with a soft, wet plop. The deep hum swelled for a moment, then slowly subsided, the clicking sounds fading. The tentacles below retracted, the luminescence dimming. The water beneath the pier returned to its unsettling indigo stillness. The remaining villagers, their faces now serene, their eyes once again vacant, turned and began to walk slowly back towards the village, their footsteps unervingly silent. The fog remained thick and pervasive. Evelyn stood frozen, the locket in her pocket burning against her thigh. She understood now. Tide's Edge was not just haunted. It was a symbiotic organism. The deep hum was its heart, the entity below its mind, and the villagers were its willing conduits, offering themselves to maintain the eerie tranquility, the timeless stasis of the town. The disappearances were not disappearances. They were incorporations. The entity consumed, but it did not destroy. It absorbed, it integrated, it shared. Martha had joined the collective. The knowledge was a crushing weight. She fumbled for the locket in her pocket, pulling it out. Its silver surface felt warm now, vibrating faintly with the deep hum. She opened it, The picture of the terrified young woman was still there, but now, subtly, horrifyingly, the face in the photograph was beginning to shift. Her eyes, once filled with terror, were softening, taking on that unsettlingly serene, vacant expression she had seen on Martha. The face was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming Evelyn's own. She dropped the locket, recoiling in horror. The deep hum in the air grew louder, not from below, but from all around her, resonating from the fog itself. The clicking sounds returned, closer now, directly behind her. She spun around. Nothing, only the swirling, oppressive gray. But she could feel a presence, vast and cold, pressing against her, trying to envelop her. The air tasted of salt, rust, and the sickly sweet essence of transformation. She backed away, stumbling on the slick pier. The whispers came then, not distinct words, but a chorus of voices, layered and echoing, speaking directly into her mind. Join us, peace, silence, all-knowing. It was the collective consciousness of the absorbed, beckoning her into their terrifying, eternal embrace. The fog seemed to thicken further, coiling around her like a living shroud, its tendrils brushing against her face, cold and clammy. She ran, blindly, desperately, down the pier, stumbling onto the rocky shore, her boots slipping on the algae-covered stones. The deep hum roared in her ears, vibrating through her entire body. The clicking sounds were right behind her, incessant, drawing closer. She could feel the vast, unseen entity pursuing her, a colossal shadow in the perpetual fog, extending its collective consciousness, its primordial hunger, to envelop her. She reached her car, yanking the door open. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life with a shuddering cough. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, tires spitting gravel as she careened down the single, winding road, away from Tide's edge, away from the deep hum, away from the terrifying truth. But as she sped away, the fog pursued her, thick and unrelenting, clinging to the car, blurring the road ahead. The hum, she realized with a chilling certainty, was not fading. It was resonating within her. She could feel it in her bones, a deep, pervasive vibration that had nothing to do with the car engine. It was inside her, and the whispers, the collective voices, were clearer now, not external, but arising from within her own mind, her own fragmented thoughts. You are ours. You are Tide's edge. You will return. She looked into the rearview mirror. The fog was endless. The road behind her was already swallowed by the gray, and in the tiny, distorted reflection, she saw it. Her eyes, a startling, unsettling pale blue, identical to Martha's, and on her lips, a faint, unervingly serene, fixed smile. The locket, she knew, was no longer in the car. It was already back on a nightstand in Tide's edge, waiting for the next curious soul. The deep hum resonated, deep and constant. Evelyn was no longer running from Tide's edge. She was part of it, carrying its secrets, its emptiness, its terrible peace, destined to return and echo herself to the place where the world ended and the ancient hunger began.